There is a silence only certain fathers know how to make. Not the silence of a man with nothing to say, the silence of a man who has already decided everything. My father, Raymond Whitfield, spent 31 years on the federal bench. He had watched men lie under oath and unravel in real time. He knew the most dangerous response to betrayal is not anger. It is patience. Derek stood up at 7:43 p.m. and introduced the woman beside him. Sienna, 27, 5 months pregnant, rose gold bracelet on her wrist that I had never seen before. My father set down his Bordeaux, stood, buttoned the single button on his charcoal jacket. He looked at Derek the way I had seen him look at exactly one other man 3 seconds before that man's career ended permanently in a federal courtroom in 2009. Then he walked out. No words, no scene, no explanation. I stayed 4 more minutes, long enough to watch Derek's confidence quietly leave his face. My father straightened his cufflinks on the way out the door. That was the only warning Derek would never learn to read. Before we go any further, what time is it where you are right now? Drop your time and your country in the comments. Atlanta has a way of making you believe in permanence. The skyline at dusk from the window of a Buckhead high-rise looks like something that was always there and always will be. The oak trees on West Pace's Ferry Road grow so wide and so old, they arch over the street like a cathedral ceiling. The old money in this city does not announce itself. It simply exists quietly in the background of everything, in the names on building plaques, in the initials on trust fund documents, in the handshakes exchanged at the right tables in the right restaurants on Thursday evenings. I had grown up inside that quietness. Raymond Whitfield's daughter, the judge's girl. I learned early that the people in this city who actually held power were never the loudest ones in the room. I met Derek Caldwell at a fundraiser for the Woodruff Arts Center in the spring of 2015. He was 30 years old, newly launched, the kind of man who filled a room with forward momentum. He had a development company with 2 completed projects and a 3rd under contract. He talked about Atlanta's West Side the way architects talk about unfinished cathedrals, like the potential was almost too large to hold in one conversation. My father shook his hand that night and said 4 words. Good bones, keep going. Derek held on to those 4 words for 9 years. He framed them in a way inside everything he built. He referenced them in interviews. He mentioned them at dinners. He did not know, could not have known, that Raymond Whitfield had said those words, not as a compliment, but as an assessment. The way a man checks the structural integrity of a building before he decides whether to invest in it quietly through 3 layers of holding companies, in a way that would never show up with his name attached. Derek never asked where his first office space came from. The lease was below market rate, handled through a property management company called Ardent Realty Group. He assumed it was luck or timing or the natural reward for being good at what he did. He was good at what he did. That part was true. But luck had very little to do with the trajectory of Derek Caldwell's career in Atlanta real estate. I knew because my father told me 6 months after our wedding, quietly over coffee at his kitchen table on a Sunday morning. He slid a single sheet of paper across to me, a summary 1-page, no letterhead. 3 projects, the addresses, the holding structure, the total exposure. He doesn't know, my father said. And he doesn't need to, as long as things stay as they are. I folded the paper and put it in my bag, and never mentioned it to Derek. I told myself it was because I did not want him to feel diminished. I told myself he had earned everything on his own merits, which was partially true. I told myself a lot of things in those early years that I would later understand were just the stories I needed to keep the life I had chosen feeling like solid ground. Derek was a good husband for the first 4 years. Attentive, present, the kind of man who remembered which flowers I preferred and which restaurants made me feel seen rather than observed. We bought the house on Tuxedo Road in 2018, 5 bedrooms, a kitchen. We spent 3 months renovating a backyard with an old magnolia tree that dropped white blossoms every May like it was marking time for us. We talked about children in the abstract, the way people do when they are happy, but not yet ready in the future tense, with a warmth that felt like a promise neither of us had formally made. The first time I noticed the distance, I could not name it. It arrived gradually the way barometric pressure shifts before a storm, subtle enough that you keep going about your day, telling yourself it is nothing, the weather is always changing. Derek started working later, started traveling to Miami more frequently, started sleeping with his phone face down on the nightstand, which he had never done before. I noticed. I did not ask. I think some part of me already understood that the answer would cost more than I was prepared to pay at the time. The crack appeared clearly on a Tuesday in August. I was dropping Derek's dry cleaning in the bedroom closet when I found a receipt folded into the breast pocket of his gray blazer. The Optimist, a restaurant on the west side. Dinner for 9:47 p.m. on a Wednesday 3 weeks earlier. Derek had told me he was in Jacksonville that Wednesday. I had texted him good night, and he had responded with a photograph of a hotel room ceiling that I now understood belonged to no hotel in Jacksonville. I held that receipt for a long time. Then I put it back exactly where I found it. I called my father that evening, not about the receipt. I just called to hear his voice. He asked me how I was sleeping. I told him fine. He said, "Mia." When something isn't right, your voice drops half a register. I've known that since you were 9 years old. I didn't say anything for a moment. "I know, Daddy," I said finally. He didn't push. He never pushed. He simply said, "I'm here," and let the silence do the rest. That was 6 weeks before the dinner at Bones. 6 weeks during which I moved through my life with a kind of careful precision, going to work, coming home, preparing for a future I could feel collapsing beneath the surface, like a sinkhole forming slowly under a perfectly paved road. I did not know then exactly what my father would do when the moment came. I knew only that Raymond Whitfield had spent a lifetime watching people underestimate the cost of their choices, and that he had never once been wrong about when the bill was coming due. The thing about betrayal is that it rarely arrives as a revelation. It arrives as a collection of small details that you file away without meaning to, each one unremarkable on its own. Each one a single thread that only becomes a pattern when you finally allow yourself to lay them all flat and look at what they make together. I am a structural engineer. I have spent 12 years understanding how things fail. Not dramatically, not all at once, but through the slow accumulation of stress at specific load points, through hairline fractures that propagate invisibly until the morning they don't. I should have recognized the pattern earlier. The professional irony of that is not lost on me. The first thread was the cologne. Derek had worn the same fragrance for 7 years. Creed Aventus. I knew it the way you know the smell of your own home, not consciously, just as a baseline condition of your life. In early July, I pressed my face into the shoulder of his suit jacket hanging on the bedroom door and smelled something underneath the familiar, something softer floral, with a synthetic warmth that did not belong to him. I stood there for a moment. Then I went and made coffee. The second thread was the Rolex. It was not just any watch. It was the watch my father had given Derek at our wedding reception, a 1987 Rolex date, just in stainless steel with a champagne dial. The kind of piece that is not bought so much as transferred, passed from one man to another as a statement about trust and continuity. My father had worn it for 20 years before he removed it that evening and placed it on Derek's wrist in front of 43 people at the Piedmont Driving Club. In late July, I noticed Derek had stopped wearing it during the week. He wore it on weekends when we were together. On weekday mornings, it sat on the nightstand, charging tray where it had always lived. But twice, once on a Monday, once on a Thursday. I came home before he expected me, and the watch was not on the tray. It was in his jacket pocket instead. as if he had taken it off somewhere and not yet returned it to its place. I did not ask about the watch either. The third thread was a name. I was loading the dishwasher on a Wednesday evening when Derek's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up for 3 seconds before going dark. I was not trying to read it. But the name was large, and the kitchen was quiet, and my eyes were already at counter level. Sienna. One word, no last name, no context. The preview cut off before I could see the message. I finished loading the dishwasher. I dried my hands on the kitchen towel, the blue linen one we had bought together at a market in Savannah on our 4th anniversary. I thought about the receipt from the optimist. I thought about the cologne. I thought about the watch disappearing on weekdays. I thought about my father's voice on the phone 6 weeks earlier. Your voice drops half a register. That night, I did something I had never done in 9 years of marriage. I waited until Derek was in the shower and I picked up his phone. I did not know his passcode. I had never needed to. But he had used Face ID since we got married, and, when I held the phone up, it opened immediately, which told me something about the way guilt operates. It makes you careless in the places you feel safest. There were 41 messages from Sienna in a thread that went back 11 months. I did not read all of them. I read enough. The language was not the language of something new. It was the language of something settled, something that had developed its own rhythms and rituals and private vocabulary. There was a message from 3 weeks earlier sent at 11:22 p.m. on the Wednesday. Derek was supposedly in Jacksonville. The ceiling in this room is terrible. Wish you were here to complain about it with me. There was a message from 6 days before that sent on a Sunday afternoon while I was in the backyard, reading beneath the magnolia tree. 5 months tomorrow. We need to talk about what happens next. I put the phone back on the counter exactly as I had found it. I went to the backyard and sat under the magnolia tree in the dark for a long time, listening to the city move around me, the distant sound of Peachtree Road traffic, a dog barking 2 houses over, the specific silence of a Thursday night in a neighborhood where everyone has somewhere comfortable to be. 5 months tomorrow. I had known something was wrong. I had not known the scale of it. There is a difference between suspecting a hairline fracture and discovering that the load-bearing wall has been compromised for nearly a year. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that because people always expect the crying to come first. It didn't. What came first was a kind of crystalline calm. The same calm I feel on a job site when I identify a structural problem, when the emotion falls away. And what remains is pure assessment. What is the damage? What are the variables? What are the options? I went inside. I washed my face. I got into bed. Derek came out of the shower 20 minutes later, smelling of his correct cologne, and kissed me on the forehead before turning off the light. His Rolex was back on the nightstand charging tray where it belonged. I lay in the dark and thought about my father, not about what to tell him. I already knew I would tell him everything. I thought instead about something he had said to me years ago when I was 11 years old. And a girl at school had humiliated me in front of the entire class over something I no longer remember. I had come home furious, ready to react already, planning my response for the following morning. My father had looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "The first move is always theirs, Mia. The last move is always yours. Don't confuse the two." I had not understood it then. Lying in the dark next to a man who had been building a second life for 11 months while I slept beside him, I understood it completely. The dinner at Bones was 2 weeks away. Derek was going to make his first move. He just didn't know yet that I already knew it was coming. Derek made the reservation himself. That detail matters, because in 9 years of marriage, Derek had never once made a dinner reservation without my involvement. I handled the logistics of our social life the way I handled everything, methodically, with attention to detail, with a preference for places where the noise level allowed actual conversation. Derek showed up. Derek ordered the wine. Derek worked the room afterward with the particular ease of a man who had learned that charm is its own form of currency in Atlanta. So when he told me on a Monday morning casually over coffee that he had booked a table at Bones for Thursday evening and wanted to invite my parents, I noticed the deviation. I filed it. I said that sounded nice. He said he wanted it to be a family dinner. He used that word specifically, family. I called my mother that afternoon. She said Raymond had already confirmed. I asked her if she knew what the dinner was about. She paused for a moment, in the way she pauses when she knows more than she is ready to say, then told me Derek had called my father directly earlier that morning. She did not know what they had discussed. I thought about that for the rest of the week. Derek calling my father confirming without telling me anything. The two of them having a conversation, I was not part of the contents of which I could not determine. I ran the variables. I could not make them resolve into anything that made sense, not yet. Thursday arrived the way significant evenings always do, dressed like an ordinary day until they aren't. I wore a black dress I had owned for 3 years, simple, structured, the kind of thing that requires no explanation. I put on the small gold stud earrings my father had given me on my 21st birthday. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment and thought, whatever happens tonight, you already know. You have already decided who you are on the other side of it. Derek wore the gray blazer. The same gray blazer from whose breast pocket I had retrieved the receipt from the Optimist 2 months earlier. He wore the Rolex. My father's Rolex on his wrist to the dinner where he had invited my father. I noticed. I did not say anything. Bones on Piedmont Road on a Thursday evening in October is a specific kind of Atlanta institution. Dark wood white tablecloths, the smell of dry-aged beef and expensive bourbon. A noise level that is loud enough to provide cover for difficult conversations, but not so loud that anything important gets lost. My parents were already seated when we arrived. My mother in her navy wrap dress, composed and warm. My father in his charcoal jacket, the one he had worn to every significant occasion for as long as I could remember, with the French cuffs he favored, and the gold cufflinks shaped like scales of justice that my mother had given him on their 30th anniversary. He stood when we approached, embraced me first the way he always did, one hand at my back, one brief press of his cheek against my temple. Then he shook Derek's hand. Firm measured the handshake of a man who has spent decades reading what handshakes reveal. "Derek," he said. One word, nothing else. We ordered drinks. My father ordered his Bordeaux. My mother asked about a project I was working on in Midtown. Derek was unusually quiet for the first 20 minutes, which I attributed to nerves, which I understood, because what he was about to do required a particular species of nerve that I did not think he actually possessed. I had underestimated his capacity for audacity. That was my error. At 7:38 p.m., a woman appeared at the entrance to our section of the restaurant. I knew who she was before Derek stood up. I had seen her name on his phone. I had done what any structural engineer does when they identify a load-bearing problem. I had assessed the full scope of it. I had found her on LinkedIn, her Instagram, and a mention in a minor Atlanta lifestyle blog from 2 years ago. I knew her face. I knew her age. I knew she worked in marketing at a mid-size firm in Buckhead. What I had not known, until she walked toward our table in a fitted emerald dress that made no effort to conceal what it was there to announce, was that Derek intended to do this here. In this restaurant. In front of my parents. At a table he had reserved himself on a Thursday evening in October, with my father's Rolex on his wrist. She sat in the empty chair Derek had arranged to be placed beside him. He remained standing. "I need to say something to everyone at this table," Derek said. His voice was controlled, rehearsed, the voice of a man who had practiced this moment enough times to believe the rehearsal had prepared him for the reality. "I want to be honest with my family. This is Sienna. We've been together for almost a year. She's expecting our child. I think everyone deserves to know the truth." The table was silent. My mother's hand found her water glass and held it without lifting it. I looked at my father. Raymond Whitfield did not look at Sienna. He did not look at me. He looked at Derek with the expression I had described before, that specific calibrated stillness that I had seen only once in my life, prior to that moment in a federal courtroom, 3 seconds before consequence arrived. He picked up his glass of Bordeaux, set it back down with a sound so small it should not have been audible above the restaurant noise, and yet I heard it with complete clarity. He placed both hands flat on the white tablecloth. He stood. He buttoned the single button on his charcoal jacket. He straightened his cufflinks left first, then right. 2 precise movements, unhurried the way a man prepares himself, not for a fight, but for a decision he has already made. He looked at Derek one final time. Not with anger, not with grief, with something I can only describe as the particular patience of a man who has just confirmed what he already knew, and has now moved from the assessment phase to the resolution phase in the same quiet transition I had watched him make on a bench for 31 years. Then he turned to my mother, offered his hand. She took it without a word, rose with the dignity of a woman who understood exactly what was happening. And they walked out together, through the restaurant, past the bar, through the front door, into the October evening. Derek was still standing. His mouth was slightly open. The rehearsed control had left his face. What remained was the expression of a man who had prepared for several possible responses and had not prepared for the one he received. I sat for 4 more minutes. I finished my water. I looked at Sienna, who was staring at the tablecloth with her hands folded in her lap, wearing the expression of a woman who had also not prepared for this particular version of the evening. I looked at the Rolex on Derek's wrist. I looked at the candle on the table burning with the complete indifference of fire to human circumstance. Then I stood up, smoothed my dress, picked up my bag. "I'll have my attorney contact yours," I said. "Enjoy your dinner." I walked out through the same door my parents had used. Outside on Piedmont Road, the October air was cool and smelled of exhaust and cut grass and the particular atmospheric quality of an Atlanta evening when the humidity has finally broken for the season. My father was standing beside his car. My mother was already inside. He was looking at his phone, unhurried the way a man looks at something he has been expecting. He looked up when I reached him. "Monday," he said. I nodded. He opened the car door, got in, and drove away into the Atlanta night as though Thursday evening had been entirely unremarkable, which for Raymond Whitfield, I understood it essentially had been. The house on Tuxedo Road was quiet when I got home, not the quiet of an empty house. Derek's car was in the driveway, which meant he had left Bones shortly after I did, which meant the evening had not proceeded as planned for anyone at that table. I sat in my own car in the driveway for 6 minutes before going inside. I counted them on the dashboard clock. I have always done this, given myself a specific, bounded amount of time to feel something before I am required to function again. My therapist calls it structured processing. I call it the only way I know how to stay vertical. The house smelled like the candles I had lit that morning. Bergamot and cedar. I had lit them out of habit, the way you maintain the routines of a life, even when you can feel the life itself shifting underneath you. Derek was in the kitchen. He had loosened his tie and poured 2 fingers of bourbon, which he was holding without drinking. He looked at me when I came in with the expression of a man who has spent the drive home rehearsing an opening line and has arrived at the conclusion that no opening line is adequate. I did not help him find one. I set my bag on the entryway table. I removed my earrings, the gold studs my father had given me, and placed them carefully in the small ceramic dish on the console where I always put them. I walked to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and drank half of it standing at the counter. Derek said my name. I looked at him. I know how that looked, he said. It looked like exactly what it was, I said. He set down the bourbon. He told me he had not meant for it to happen this way. He told me Sienna had given him an ultimatum that she needed acknowledgement, needed legitimacy, needed the people in his life to know the truth. He used the word forced, as in he had been forced into the timing. He used the word complicated, as in the situation was complicated. He used the word sorry once in the middle of a sentence about his own discomfort, which told me everything I needed to know about the nature of the apology. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt. I have learned from my father, from 12 years of job sites, from the specific education of being a black woman who is regularly underestimated in professional rooms, that listening completely is itself a form of power. You cannot respond accurately to what you have not fully heard. And I needed to hear everything Derek was willing to say that evening because I was already building the record. My phone was in my jacket pocket. The voice memo application had been running since I got into my car in the parking lot at Bones. It was still running. When Derek finished, I said, "I understand." He looked relieved in a way that concerned me, as if understanding and forgiveness were the same transaction. "I think we should talk about what happens next," he said. Practically speaking. I told him I agreed. He told me he had spoken to a friend who was a divorce attorney. He told me carefully, with the cadence of a man who has practiced this part, that he thought a clean, quiet dissolution would be best for everyone. He suggested I could keep the house. He framed this as generosity. He said the word reasonable 4 times in 6 minutes. He said he hoped we could handle this like adults. He said he did not want things to get complicated. That word again. Complicated. I told him I would think about it. He nodded. He seemed to believe in that moment that the evening had moved from catastrophe to negotiation, which is what men like Derek believe when a woman stops arguing that her silence is acquiescence rather than strategy. 9 years of marriage, and he still did not know the difference between the two when he saw it on my face. He went upstairs. I sat at the kitchen counter for a long time after I heard the bedroom door close. I thought about the house. The kitchen we had spent 3 months renovating, the magnolia tree in the backyard. The particular quality of morning light through the east-facing windows that I had loved since the first day we toured it. I thought about whether I wanted to keep it. I decided I did not. A house is a structure. Structures can be rebuilt. What matters is the foundation, and I was not interested in building anything further on the foundation of the last 9 years. At 11:04 p.m., I called my father. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had been awake, which meant he had been waiting. "Daddy," I said. "I'm here," he said. I told him about the kitchen conversation. I told him about the voice memo. I told him Derek had mentioned a divorce attorney and had offered me the house as if it were a prize rather than a liability with a mortgage. I told him Derek had used the word reasonable 4 times. My father was quiet for a moment. "Did he mention the West Side project?" he said. "No," I said. "He will," my father said. "Give him until Friday." I asked him what was happening on Monday. He said, "An attorney named Charles Odom is going to walk into Derek's office at 9 in the morning. You don't need to be there. You don't need to do anything between now and then, except sleep." I asked him how long he had been preparing for this. There was a pause, not a long one. "Since the Wednesday he told you he was in Jacksonville," my father said quietly. I sat with that for a moment. My father had known before I told him. He had known because he had spent 31 years learning to read the register of his daughter's voice, and because Raymond Whitfield, once he identified a load-bearing problem, did not wait for the collapse to begin his assessment. He had been quietly building his response since August. "Get some sleep, Mia," he said. I told him I would try. I went to the living room couch. I did not go upstairs. I lay down without changing my clothes and stared at the ceiling of the house I had already decided to leave. Outside, the magnolia tree moved slightly in the October wind, its last white blossoms long gone, its branches bare and patient in the dark. I took off my wedding ring and placed it on the coffee table, not dramatically, not as a statement. Simply because it no longer felt like an accurate description of my life, and I have never been able to tolerate wearing things that aren't true. I slept better than I had in months. Derek found the wedding ring on the coffee table Friday morning. I know because I was in the kitchen when he came downstairs, and I heard him stop in the living room doorway, that specific quality of silence that a person makes when they encounter something they were not prepared to see. He stood there for a moment. Then he came into the kitchen and poured coffee without mentioning it, which told me he had decided to treat it as a negotiating position rather than a conclusion. Derek had always been better at transactions than at truth. He was dressed for the office. The Rolex was on his wrist. I noted that. He sat across from me at the kitchen island and told me he had been thinking. He said he wanted to approach the situation with maturity. He used the word amicable twice in the first 3 minutes, which is the word people use when they want to sound reasonable while presenting terms that are not. He told me he had spoken to his attorney again, a man named Holt, from a firm in Midtown, and that they had drafted a preliminary framework for a dissolution agreement. He slid a folded piece of paper across the island. I did not unfold it. He told me the broad terms. The house in my name mortgage, assumed by me. A single lump sum payment of $85,000, which he described as more than fair given our asset structure. No spousal support. A mutual non-disclosure clause covering the circumstances of the marriage's dissolution, meaning I would not discuss the nature of his relationship with Sienna or the timing of her pregnancy with anyone in our social or professional network. He said this last part carefully with the practiced calm of a man who has been coached on exactly how to present it. He called it a clean exit. I looked at the folded paper on the island between us. I thought about $85,000. I thought about 9 years. I thought about the voice memo on my phone, now transferred to a secure cloud folder, time-stamped 31 minutes of Derek's own words on the record. I thought about Charles Odom, who would be walking into Derek's office in 72 hours. "I'll have my attorney review it," I said. Derek nodded. He seemed satisfied. He topped off his coffee. He told me he thought this was the right approach. He told me he was glad I was being practical. He used the word practical the way people use it when they mean compliant. And I let him believe those were the same thing, for the same reason I had let him believe everything else that week. Because a man who believes he has already won stops paying attention to the details, and the details were everything. He left for the office at 8:15. I called my attorney, not a divorce attorney, not yet, but Margaret Chen, who had been my personal attorney for 6 years and who had handled the legal structure of my own engineering consultancy since I founded it in 2019. I read her the terms Derek had presented. She was quiet for a moment, then said 3 words, "Do not sign." I told her I had no intention of signing. She asked me if I was aware of the full scope of my marital assets. I told her I had some awareness. She told me she would need 48 hours and access to 4 years of joint financial disclosures before she could give me a complete picture. I gave her everything she needed before noon. Friday passed. Saturday arrived with the particular Atlanta quality of a fall weekend, cool and clear, the kind of day that makes the city look like a promise it is occasionally capable of keeping. I went to my office. I worked on the Midtown project, which was entering its final structural review phase, and required the kind of focused attention that had always been the most reliable form of therapy I knew. Derek texted at 2 p.m. to ask if I had reviewed the agreement. I responded, "Still reviewing. Margaret is looking at it." He responded, "Who is Margaret, my attorney?" I wrote back. There was a pause of 11 minutes before his next message arrived. When it did, the tone had shifted something tighter, less rehearsed, the first sign of pressure beginning to show through the surface of his composure. Mia, I really think we should handle this between ourselves. Attorneys make everything more complicated and expensive. That word again. Complicated. I had counted 6 uses across 4 days. I did not respond. Sunday evening he called. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long, which I know because I checked the timestamp before I forwarded it to Margaret without listening to it myself. She could listen. I was done using my attention on the sound of his voice, constructing reasons why I should make his situation easier to manage. Sunday night, I had dinner with my parents at my father's house on Habersham Road. My mother made her short ribs, which she only makes for occasions she considers significant, which told me she understood the weight of the week without needing it explained. We ate at the dining room table. We talked about my Midtown project, about a trip my parents were considering to Portugal in the spring, about a documentary my mother had watched twice and insisted I needed to see. My father said very little through dinner. He ate methodically the way he always does, with the unhurried attention of a man who considers meals important enough to be present for. After dessert, when my mother had gone to the kitchen, he looked at me across the table. "Has he mentioned the West Side project?" he said. "Not yet," I said. My father nodded slowly. "He will call you tomorrow," he said. "He'll mention needing to discuss business matters as part of the settlement. He'll want you to agree to something before Monday morning." I asked my father how he knew that. He looked at me with the patience of a man who has watched 31 years of human nature under pressure perform exactly as predicted. "Because Holt, his attorney, will have run a preliminary asset search over the weekend," he said. "And by Sunday evening, he will have found enough to know that something in Derek's structure doesn't add up. He'll tell Derek tonight, and Derek will call you tomorrow morning, before 9. I looked at my father across the dinner table, at the French cuffs, at the gold cufflinks, at the stillness of a man who had not raised his voice once in the 11 days since the dinner at Bones, who had made no scene, sent no messages, made no calls that Derek knew about. "How long have you been thinking about this?" I said. He considered the question with the same precision he applied to everything. "I began thinking about the day I gave him that watch," my father said, "about what it would mean if I ever needed to ask for it back." He folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate. "Get home safely," he said. "Sleep well. Tomorrow's just the beginning." I drove home through the Atlanta Sunday night, past the oak trees on West Pace's Ferry Road, arching overhead like they always had, like they always would, permanent and unhurried and rooted in something so deep that no single season could touch it. My phone rang at 8:47 the following morning. Derek's name on the screen. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. "Mia," he said. His voice had changed. The rehearsed control was gone entirely. What remained was the voice of a man standing at the edge of something he had not seen coming, looking down. "I need to talk to you about the business. There are some things we need to discuss before anything gets filed, before lawyers start pulling documents. I think we need to sit down today. This morning, if possible." I looked at the clock on my kitchen wall. 8:49 a.m. Charles Odom would be walking through Derek's office door in 11 minutes. "I'm not available this morning," I said. "Have your attorney call Margaret." I ended the call, set the phone face up on the counter, and made myself a second cup of coffee with the complete and absolute calm of a woman who has already seen the blueprint of what is coming and knows down to the load-bearing detail exactly how it is going to fall. Charles Odom was 63 years old and had been practicing corporate and trust law in Atlanta for 37 years. He was not the kind of attorney who raised his voice in meetings. He was not the kind of attorney who sent threatening letters or made dramatic phone calls or leveraged the press. He was the kind of attorney who arrived at 9 o'clock in the morning carrying a single leather portfolio, sat down across from you in your own conference room, and placed documents on the table with the unhurried precision of a man who has done this enough times to know that the papers speak more effectively than he ever could. I know the details of what happened in Derek's office that Monday morning because Margaret Chen received a full briefing from Odom's office by noon, and because Margaret, who has the particular gift of delivering catastrophic information in the tone of someone reading a grocery list, called me at 12:17 p.m. and said, "You're going to want to sit down for this, although I suspect you already know most of it." I was already sitting. I had been sitting at my desk since 9:30, doing very little actual work, waiting. Odom had arrived at Derek's Buckhead office at precisely 9 o'clock. Derek's assistant had shown him to the main conference room where Derek was already waiting with Holt, his attorney, and a junior associate from Holt's firm, who was there to take notes, and I imagined to absorb the specific education of watching what happened next. Odom opened his portfolio. He removed a document and placed it in the center of the table. 14 pages, tabbed, indexed, annotated in the margins in the precise shorthand of a man who has spent 4 decades building cases that do not leak. The document outlined the following. In 2016, 6 months after Derek and I were married, a Delaware-registered holding company called Meridian Capital Partners, LLC had acquired a 43% stake in Caldwell Development Group through a series of convertible notes totaling $22.4 million. The transaction had been structured through 2 intermediate entities, Ardent Realty Group, which Derek knew as his original landlord, and a second company called Vantage Bridge Holdings, in a manner that was entirely legal, entirely disclosed in the relevant filings, and entirely invisible to anyone who was not looking for it, with the specific knowledge of where to look. Meridian Capital Partners, LLC was wholly owned by the Raymond J. Whitfield Family Trust, established 1994 Raymond J. Whitfield Trustee. In 2019, as Caldwell Development Group began its expansion into 3 major West Side Atlanta projects. The ones Derek referenced in every interview as the cornerstone of his legacy, Meridian had provided an additional $24.7 million in structured financing through a separate instrument. This instrument contained on page 11, subsection 4, paragraph 3, a covenant that had been drafted with the kind of specificity that only becomes visible in retrospect. The covenant stated that in the event of the dissolution of the marriage between Derek Anthony Caldwell and Mia Raymond Whitfield, where such dissolution resulted from conduct constituting marital fault on the part of Derek Anthony Caldwell, as defined under Georgia Code section. May 3, 19, all outstanding notes held by Meridian Capital Partners, LLC would become immediately due and payable, and Meridian's equity stake in Caldwell Development Group would convert from passive to active, granting Meridian the right to appoint a majority of the board of directors pending full repayment. Total outstanding obligations to Meridian Capital Partners, LLC as of October of that year, $47.1 million. Margaret told me there was a silence in the conference room after Odom finished his summary that lasted, according to Holt's junior associate's notes, approximately 40 seconds. She told me this with the same neutral delivery she uses for everything, but I heard the faintest trace of something underneath it. Not satisfaction exactly, but the professional appreciation of a person who recognizes a piece of work that has been executed with uncommon precision. Derek had spoken first. He had asked, and I am told his voice was remarkably controlled, given the circumstances, whether this document was legitimate. Odom had said yes. Derek had asked whether it had been disclosed to him prior to the marriage. Odom had said no, and that it had not been required to be as it pertained to the trust's investment activities, rather than to any prenuptial or marital agreement, and that Derek's own attorneys at the time of the various financing transactions had reviewed and signed off on all relevant documentation without identifying the ultimate beneficial owner of Meridian, which was not Odom's client's obligation to clarify. Derek had then asked what his options were. Odom had placed a second document on the table. This one was 3 pages. It outlined a single path forward, a structured settlement in which Derek would enter into a negotiated repayment schedule for the $47.1 million, retain operational control of Caldwell Development Group under an oversight structure appointed by Meridian, and relinquish any claim to the marital home on Tuxedo Road, which had been purchased in 2018 using funds that Margaret's review of the joint financials had identified as originating indirectly from Ardent Realty Group's below-market lease payments money that had in effect always belonged to the trust. In addition, the settlement required Derek to withdraw the non-disclosure clause from his proposed dissolution agreement. Entirely, without negotiation. Holt had objected at that point. Odom had looked at him with the patience of a man who anticipated the objection and had already decided it was not worth addressing in detail. He had simply said, "Mr. Holt, your client's leverage in this conversation is not what he believed it was on Friday. I'd suggest we proceed accordingly." Margaret told me Holt had not responded to that. I sat at my desk after the call and looked out the window at Midtown Atlanta, the cranes, the glass towers catching the afternoon light, the skyline of a city that had been built and rebuilt and built again on the same red Georgia clay, by people who understood that what looks permanent from a distance is always on closer inspection. A negotiation between ambition and foundation. Derek called me 4 times between noon and 3 o'clock. I forwarded each call to Margaret. At 3:47 p.m., Holt's office contacted Margaret's office to request a conversation about the settlement terms. Margaret called me immediately after to ask whether I wanted her to proceed. I told her yes. I told her one additional thing, that I wanted a specific item returned as part of the settlement. Not money, not property. A 1987 Rolex date-just stainless steel champagne dial. Serial number on record with the Whitfield Family Trust since 1994, when my father had purchased it. The same watch he had transferred to Derek's wrist at the Piedmont Driving Club on our wedding day, in front of 43 witnesses, under the assumption, reasonable at the time, that the man receiving it had earned the right to carry it forward. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I'll add it to the schedule," she said. I thanked her and ended the call. Outside the window, the October afternoon was burning toward dusk, the sky going that particular Atlanta gold that happens in fall when the light drops at an angle through the tree canopy and makes everything look briefly, improbably like a painting of itself. My phone buzzed. A text from my father. 3 words, Odom called. Good. I looked at those 3 words for a long time. From my father, who had spent 31 years on the federal bench, measuring his words with the precision of a man who understood that what you say matters significantly less than what you have already done. 3 words were the equivalent of a standing ovation. I typed back 2. "Thank you." He responded in 4 seconds. "Get back to work." I laughed the first time I had laughed in 2 weeks, genuinely, without effort. Then I turned back to my screen and pulled up the structural drawings for the Midtown project and got back to work exactly as instructed. $47.1 million. Derek had introduced his pregnant mistress at a family dinner wearing the watch my father had given him as a symbol of trust and continuity and the assumption of good faith. He had done it in front of Raymond Whitfield, who had spent 23 years quietly building the financial architecture inside which Derek's entire career existed, and who had responded by standing up, buttoning his jacket, straightening his cufflinks, and walking out of the restaurant without a single word. He had not needed words. The documents were already written. The covenant was already in place. The clock, the real one, not the Rolex, had started running the moment Derek stood up from that table. It had taken exactly 1 Monday morning to reach the end of its count. I did not plan to go to Derek's office that Tuesday afternoon. That is the truth, and I want to be precise about it, because the version of events that circulated later through the specific social infrastructure of Atlanta's upper professional class, which operates like a very well-dressed telephone wire, suggested that I had orchestrated the timing of my arrival for maximum effect. I had not. I had gone because Margaret called at 1:30 p.m. to tell me that Holt's office had requested a 48-hour extension on the settlement response, citing Derek's need to consult additional counsel, and that she believed the request was a delay tactic designed to give Derek time to move certain assets before the oversight structure took effect. She recommended I deliver something in person, something that would clarify without ambiguity the cost of further delay. I knew what to bring. I signed out of my office at 1:52 p.m. I wore what I had worn to work that morning, a charcoal wool coat over a white silk blouse, dark trousers, low heels. Nothing theatrical, nothing designed. The clothes of a woman going to a meeting, which is what I was doing. Derek's office was on the 34th floor of a glass tower on Peachtree Road. Caldwell Development Group occupied the entire floor open plan with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Buckhead. And on clear days, the faint suggestion of Stone Mountain to the east. I had been to the office many times over the years. I knew the receptionist, a young woman named Brianna, who had been there for 3 years, and who looked at me when I stepped off the elevator with an expression that confirmed she was aware, at least partially, of the events of the previous 4 days. I told her I was there to see Derek. She picked up the phone. I told her not to announce me. She looked uncertain. I told her gently, but without room for misinterpretation, that it was fine, and that Derek was expecting something from me today, which was true in the broadest sense. She set the phone down. I walked through the open office. Several people looked up. I recognized Face's project managers, a senior architect named Paul, who had worked with Derek for 6 years, the finance director whose name I could never remember, but whose expression when he saw me told me the staff knew more about the state of things than Derek likely intended. The atmosphere on the floor had the particular quality of a room in which something significant has recently been discussed, and not resolved a residual tension in the air, like the smell after a storm has moved through but not yet cleared. Derek was in the main conference room. I could see him through the glass wall before he saw me. He was on the phone, standing at the window, with his back to the door, looking out over Buckhead, with the posture of a man sustaining a weight he had not anticipated carrying. His jacket was off. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. The Rolex was on his wrist, which I had expected, which was why I had brought what I brought. His phone was ringing on the conference table when I opened the door. Not his cell, the desk line. It rang twice while he was still on his mobile, then went to voicemail, then immediately began ringing again. He turned when he heard the door. The expression that crossed his face in the 2 seconds before he controlled it contained more honest information than anything he had said to me in the previous 11 days. It was not guilt I had seen from him before in smaller quantities in earlier years, and it had a particular quality of self-pity that I recognized. This was something else. This was the expression of a man who has been playing a game he believed he understood and has just realized at a very late stage that he did not know the rules. He ended his call. "Mia," he said. "I wasn't expecting." "I know," I said. I set my bag on the conference table. I reached inside and removed a single item which I placed on the table between us and did not touch again. A small padded envelope, unsealed, containing a 1987 Rolex date-just stainless steel champagne dial. I had retrieved it from the nightstand charging tray that morning, while Derek was in the shower, the same way he had been taking it off and pocketing it on weekdays for 2 months, quietly, without announcement, as if it were simply a minor administrative matter. Derek looked at the watch on the table. He looked at his own wrist, then back at the table, then at me. "My father would like that returned," I said. "It's itemized on page 2 of the settlement schedule Margaret sent this morning. We thought it was easier to handle it directly." The desk phone began ringing again. Derek glanced at it. I recognized the number on the display. It was a 404 area code. A buckhead prefix, the kind of number that belongs to a bank's commercial lending division. I knew this because Margaret had told me that First National's commercial portfolio team had been attempting to reach Derek's office since 10 a.m. regarding a covenant review trigger on the West Side project financing. Derek did not answer it. He looked at the Rolex on the table for a moment longer. Then he reached up and unclasped the watch from his wrist with 2 careful movements, the same 2 movements my father used when he took it off every night, unhurried, precise, the muscle memory of a man who respects what he is handling. He placed it beside the padded envelope. He did not put it inside. I think he could not quite bring himself to do that last step. I picked it up myself and placed it in the envelope and folded the flap closed. The 48-hour extension, I said. Margaret needs an answer by 5 o'clock today, not tomorrow. Derek's jaw tightened. Mia, there are things about the structure of this that you don't fully... I understand the structure completely, I said. Page 11, subsection 4, paragraph 3. Marital fault as defined under Georgia Code 19-5-3. Immediate acceleration of the outstanding notes. Board conversion rights, pending repayment. I paused. I've read the document, Derek. My father made sure I understood it before Monday. The phone stopped ringing. The conference room was very quiet. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Atlanta continued its afternoon, the traffic on Peachtree, a construction crane. Turning slowly against the October sky, the city conducting itself with a complete indifference to individual human crisis that cities have always had and always will. Derek sat down, not dramatically. Not in defeat exactly, more in the way of a man whose legs have made a decision his pride has not yet caught up to. He sat in the chair at the head of the conference table, where he had always sat in his own office in the building where he had spent 6 years building something he believed was entirely his. And he looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him before, and could not name precisely, somewhere between grief and the particular exhaustion of a man who has been sustaining a performance for so long that he has forgotten what it cost him. I didn't think he would do this, Derek said, quietly, without the rehearsed control, just the words plain as they actually were. I know, I said. He never said anything. 9 years, and he never... He didn't need to, I said. That was the point. Derek looked at the padded envelope on the table between us. What does he want? Derek said. Beyond the money, beyond the settlement. What does Raymond actually want out of this? I considered the question. It was, I thought, the most honest thing Derek had asked in 11 days. Perhaps in longer than that. He wants what he's always wanted, I said. For me to be all right. Derek was quiet. The desk phone began ringing again. First National, same number, same relentless patience of institutional money waiting to be addressed. Derek looked at it with the expression of a man who understands he is out of time for conversations that do not involve attorneys and repayment schedules. I picked up my bag. I put the padded envelope inside. Have Holt call Margaret by 5, I said. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. I walked out through the glass door, through the open office, past Paul the architect and the finance director, and Brianna at the reception desk, into the elevator down 34 floors to the lobby, out through the revolving door onto Peachtree Road in the October afternoon. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and took one long breath of Atlanta air exhaust and oak leaves and the faint mineral smell of the red clay that runs under everything in this city, under every building and every road and every carefully constructed life, the same clay that was here before any of it and will be hereafter. My phone buzzed. A text from Margaret Holt just called. They're ready to proceed. I texted back good. Then I walked to my car, placed the padded envelope carefully on the passenger seat, and drove across the city to my father's house on Habersham Road, where I left the watch on his kitchen table without a note because none was needed, and drove home in the early Atlanta dusk with the particular lightness of a woman who has just sat down. Something that was never hers to carry in the first place. The first partner to withdraw was a man named Gerald Fitch. He was a real estate investor out of Charlotte who had committed $8.2 million to Derek's West Side mixed-use project, the crown jewel of Caldwell Development Group's portfolio, the one Derek had referenced in 17 separate interviews over the past 3 years, the one whose renderings were framed and mounted on the wall of the 34th floor conference room, directly behind the chair where Derek always sat. Gerald Fitch called Derek's office at 11:14 a.m. on Wednesday morning, the day after I returned the Rolex, and spoke to Derek's operations director for 4 minutes before the call was transferred to Derek directly. The conversation lasted 9 minutes. At the end of it, Fitch cited a contractual review clause and withdrew his commitment in full. Margaret told me this. She told me most things over those 72 hours, with the same neutral grocery list delivery because she understood that information was the architecture of what we were building, and that I needed every load-bearing detail. The second partner withdrew by email at 2:30 p.m. that same day. A development fund based in Nashville. $6.5 million committed 3 years into the relationship. The email was 4 sentences. It referenced a material change in the project's financial structure. It wished Caldwell Development Group well in future endeavors. It was the kind of email that people write when they have already been told by someone they trust exactly what has changed and exactly why it matters. I did not ask my father whether he had made calls. I did not need to. Raymond Whitfield had spent 31 years on the federal bench and 4 decades before that building the kind of relationships that exist in the register of a handshake rather than a contract, the kind that operate through a single, well-placed conversation between 2 people who have known each other long enough to communicate entire situations in the space of 3 sentences. He had not made threats. He had not needed to. He had simply, I imagined, told the truth to the people who needed to hear it in the quiet and unhurried way he told every truth, and let them draw their own conclusions. The third withdrawal came Thursday morning from a private equity group in Atlanta itself. Century Point Capital, $12.7 million, the largest single outside commitment in the West Side project. Their general counsel sent a formal notice of withdrawal, citing the Meridian Covenant trigger and its implications for the project's governance structure. This one was not informal. This one had been reviewed by attorneys. This one, Margaret told me, was the one that would appear in the public record. $27.4 million. In 72 hours. Gone from the West Side project like water finding its level. By Thursday afternoon, the construction draw scheduled for the following week had been suspended pending resolution of the financing structure. The general contractor, a firm Derek had worked with for 8 years, the kind of professional relationship built on mutual reliability and shared history, sent a notice of work stoppage effective immediately. Margaret forwarded it to me without comment. Sienna left on Thursday. I know this not because I was watching, and not because anyone told me directly, but because on Thursday evening I drove past the house on Tuxedo Road for the first time since I had moved my essential belongings to my father's guest room the previous Monday. It was not something I had planned. I was driving back from a site visit, and the route took me near enough that the turn felt natural. And I made it, and I drove slowly past the house that I had lived in for 5 years, and looked at it the way you look at a place that was once your life and is now simply a structure, 4 walls, a roof. A magnolia tree in the backyard dropping no blossoms because it was October, and the magnolia had already given everything it had to give for the year. There was no car in the driveway. Not Derek's Escalade, which was unusual for a Thursday evening. Not any other car. The lights in the front of the house were off. I drove on. Margaret confirmed the following morning that Derek had vacated the house on Tuxedo Road and was staying at a hotel in Midtown, She did not tell me which one, and I did not ask. Sienna's departure I pieced together through a mutual acquaintance, a woman named Diane, who ran in the same Buckhead social circle and who texted me on Friday morning with a message that said simply, "Heard she moved back to her apartment. Hope you're okay." Which told me Sienna had left, and that the news was circulating, and which confirmed what I had already understood, that the architecture of what Derek had believed he was building alongside his marriage was constructed on the same compromised foundation as everything else. A woman does not stay for the inconvenience. She stays for the life. When the life evaporates, so does she. Derek called me on Friday afternoon. I answered this time because Margaret had advised me that a direct conversation at this stage properly handled could accelerate the settlement timeline and reduce the probability of Derek pursuing any last-ditch legal complications. He sounded different, not broken. Derek was not the kind of man who broke in ways he allowed other people to hear. But the architecture of his voice had changed. The practiced control, the rehearsed confidence, the specific cadence of a man who has always operated from a position of perceived advantage, all of it was gone. What remained was something quieter and more essential. Just a man's voice without performance. He said he wanted to talk about the settlement. I told him Margaret was handling the settlement. He said he knew. He said he wanted to talk about something else. I waited. "Did you know?" he said. Before the dinner. "Did you know about the trust? About Meridian? About all of it?" I considered the question carefully. It deserved a careful answer. "I knew my father had been involved in your early financing," I said. "I didn't know the full scope of the covenant until Margaret reviewed the documents." "But you knew something." "Yes," I said. "I knew something." He was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. And I thought about that, about the Sunday morning 6 months after our wedding, when my father had slid that single sheet of paper across the kitchen table, about the 9 years of building a life inside a structure whose full architecture neither Derek nor I had ever examined completely, about the particular human capacity for not looking directly at the things we are not yet ready to know. "For the same reason you didn't tell me about Sienna for 11 months, I said. "Because I thought what we had was worth protecting." The silence on the line had a different quality than all the previous silences. Not tactical, not strategic. Just honest, the specific silence of two people who have finally arrived at the truth of a thing after a very long and circuitous route. "I'm sorry, Mia," he said. Not in the middle of a sentence about his own discomfort this time. Just the words, plain as they actually were. "I know," I said. I ended the call. I sat for a moment in the quiet of my father's guest room, where I'd been sleeping for a week on clean white sheets that smelled of the particular laundry detergent my mother had used my entire life. In the house where I had grown up, in the city where I had always been Raymond Whitfield's daughter and had spent 20 years learning what that meant, and was only now beginning to understand the full weight and gift of it. My phone buzzed. Margaret. The settlement had been executed. All terms agreed. The Rolex had already been returned. The non-disclosure clause had been removed in its entirety. The house on Tuxedo Road had been released. Derek's repayment schedule to Meridian was in place, structured binding overseen by Charles Odom's office with the same precision that had characterized every document in the chain. I sat with the news for a moment. Then I got up, went downstairs, lights tea, and found my father in his study, the room lined floor to ceiling with law books and case files and framed photographs of a life spent in service to the idea that consequences are not punishments, they are simply the completion of a structure that was always going to resolve this way. He was reading. He looked up when I came in. "It's done," I said. He nodded once. The way he nods when something has concluded exactly as he understood it would, without surprise, without theater, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who built something carefully and watched it hold. He looked back at his book. On the desk beside him, next to his reading lamp and a cup of tea that had gone cold, the 1987 Rolex date just sat on its side against a stack of papers back where it had always belonged, its champagne dial catching the lamplight like it had never been anywhere else. Atlanta does not gossip the way smaller cities do. It does not need to. In the circles that matter, the ones that convene at the Piedmont Driving Club and the Capital City Club, and the annual Atlanta Business Chronicle Gala, and the boardrooms of the institutions that have shaped this city for generations. Information moves not through whisper or scandal, but through something far more efficient and far more permanent, the quality of a room's silence when a specific name is mentioned. Derek Caldwell's name began producing that silence in the third week of October. It did not happen through any announcement. There was no press release, no public statement, no article in the business section of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Raymond Whitfield did not call anyone. He did not need to. He simply continued his life attending the functions he always attended. Sitting on the boards he had always sat on, having lunch on Thursdays at his usual table at the Capitol Grill, with the same rotation of men who had known him for decades. And when Derek's name arose, as it inevitably did, in a city where professional communities are smaller than they appear, my father said nothing. He said nothing with the particular completeness of a man who has made a considered decision about what deserves his acknowledgement. In Atlanta, in these circles, Raymond Whitfield's silence about a person is its own form of information. 31 years on the federal bench. 4 decades of relationships built on the currency of his word and his judgment. When he declined to speak, people understood without requiring explanation that there was a reason, and that the reason had been weighed carefully by a man who did not make careless assessments. The Atlanta Business Chronicle Gala invitation arrived on a Thursday in late October. It was addressed to Caldwell Development Group, as it had been for the previous 4 years, as Derek had received it and attended it, and worked the room with the practiced ease of a man building a public identity alongside his business one. This year, the envelope was not sent. There was no call, no explanation, no formal disinvitation. The name simply did not appear on the list that was finalized by the event committee, 3 members of which had known Raymond Whitfield for more than 20 years. Margaret told me about this, not as legal information, but as a human footnote delivered at the end of a call about the settlement's final administrative details. She said it the way people mention weather, as a fact of the environment, neither cruel nor kind, simply accurate. The West Side Project did not die. That is an important detail. And I want to be precise about it, because what happened to Derek was not destruction, it was correction. Meridian Capital Partners, now operating in its active capacity under the settlement terms, brought in a new operations team in November. The project continued under revised governance. The construction draw resumed in the second week of the month. The general contractor returned. The building that Derek had spent 3 years describing as his legacy continued rising on the west side of Atlanta floor by floor, exactly as designed. Derek's name was no longer on the project documents. His equity had been restructured as part of the repayment schedule. He retained a minority passive interest enough to benefit if the project succeeded, not enough to control anything. He had been removed from the operational role he had occupied since the project's inception and replaced by a management team appointed by Meridian's board, which was now effectively my father's board. I heard this from Margaret and from Charles Odom's office, and once from Paul the architect, the senior man from Derek's office, who had looked up at me when I walked through the floor that Tuesday afternoon, who sent me a brief professional email in November saying that the transition had been managed well and that the project was in good hands. Paul was a careful man with his words. Coming from him, this was the equivalent of a detailed report. Sienna had returned to her apartment in Midtown. I knew this not because I tracked her, But because Atlanta is in the ways that matter, a small city, and information about people who have recently been adjacent to significant events, has a way of surfacing without effort. I knew she was still in contact with Derek. I knew the child was due in March. Beyond that, I did not allow my attention to extend in that direction. What happened between Derek and Sienna was no longer a chapter in my story. It was a different book entirely, and I had returned my copy to the shelf. My mother called me on a Sunday morning in November, the way she calls every Sunday, to ask about my week and tell me about hers, and move through the gentle domestic inventory of a family keeping itself connected across the ordinary distance of adult life. At the end of the call, she said something she had not said since the dinner at Bones. "Your father is proud of you," she said. "He doesn't say it. You know how he is. But I'm telling you because someone should." I held the phone for a moment. "I know, Mama," I said. "He sat with that watch for a long time after you brought it back," she said. "Just sat with it. Didn't say anything. You know what that means from him." I did know. From Raymond Whitfield sitting quietly with something was the equivalent of another man writing it in permanent ink. The Midtown project reached its final structural review in November and passed without a single deficiency note, the first time in my 12-year career that I had achieved a clean pass on a project of that scale. I stood in the building at 7 in the morning on the day the report came through on the 14th floor, looking out through the framed opening of a window that had not yet been glazed at the Atlanta skyline. In the early light, the cranes and the glass towers and the oak canopy of Buckhead to the north, and the faint blue suggestion of Stone Mountain to the east, the whole city laid out in the particular clarity of a November morning when the air has finally gone cold and clean. I thought about structure, about what holds and what doesn't, about the difference between a thing that looks stable from the outside and a thing that actually is, the hairline fractures you cannot see from a distance, the load-bearing elements that only become visible when you know where to look, the foundation that determines everything else, regardless of what is built on top of it. I thought about my father, who had understood the structure of things long before I did, who had built something beneath my life that I had not known the full dimensions of, until the moment it was needed, who had walked out of a restaurant on a Thursday evening in October without a single word, and set in motion a resolution so precisely calibrated that it required no revision. I thought about the cufflinks, left first, then right. 2 movements unhurried, the only warning Derek never learned to read. My phone rang. It was a number I did not recognize. A Savannah area code, a developer I'd been introduced to at a conference in September, who had been considering bringing me in on a mixed-use project on the Savannah waterfront. He said the project had been approved. He said he wanted to discuss bringing my firm on as structural lead. He said someone had recommended me, specifically someone whose recommendation he took seriously. I asked who. There was a brief pause. "A Judge Whitfield," he said. "Said you were the best structural engineer he'd ever seen work. Said you understood how things are supposed to hold." I looked out through the unglazed window at the Atlanta morning. "I learned from him," I said. "I told the developer I was interested. I told him I would call him the following week." I ended the call and stood in the unfinished building for another few minutes in the quiet of a structure that had been built correctly, that had passed every test it had been given, that would stand for decades on the foundation that had been laid for it with care and precision and the kind of patient attention that does not announce itself. Then I took the elevator down, walked out onto the Midtown street, and went to meet my father for lunch. The penthouse on Peachtree Battle Avenue closed on a Wednesday in December. I signed the documents at Margaret's office at 9 in the morning, my name alone on every page, which is a thing I want to say plainly, because the plainness of it mattered to me in a way I had not anticipated. Not my name and another name. Not my name pending another name's approval, just mine. on a clean line in black ink on a Wednesday morning in December in the city where I was born, and where my father had built something so quietly and so carefully that I had lived inside it for 34 years without knowing its full dimensions. The penthouse was on the 8th floor of a 1960s building that had been renovated with the particular restraint that good renovation requires, preserving the bones, improving the systems, leaving the character intact. It had 12-foot ceilings and original oak floors, and a terrace that faced west toward the west side of Atlanta, toward the project that was still rising floor by floor under the governance of people who understood what they were building and why. My father came to see it the Saturday after closing. He arrived at 11 with my mother, who walked through every room with the focused attention of a woman mentally furnishing spaces in real time, noting sight lines and light quality and the particular acoustics of high-ceilinged rooms, with the expertise of someone who has made a serious lifelong study of the domestic environment. My father went directly to the terrace. He stood there for a long time, looking west over the city, the oak canopy, the glass towers, the construction cranes moving slowly against the December sky. He had his hands in his coat pockets. The charcoal jacket was underneath, as always. The Rolex was on his wrist, where it had always been and would remain. I stood beside him. We did not speak for several minutes. With my father, silence has never been absence. It has always been its own form of communication, a register he operates in as fluently as language, and I have spent 34 years learning to read it with the same precision he has always read mine. What I understood from this particular silence was, this is right. This is where you should be. I always knew you would get here. My mother appeared in the terrace doorway and said the kitchen had excellent light, and asked whether I had considered the layout for a dining table. We laughed, both of us, at the same moment, the specific laughter of two people who have been through something significant together and have arrived intact at a morning that feels ordinary in the best possible way. My father looked at me. "Good bones," he said, the same two words he had said to Derek at the Woodruff Arts Center fundraiser 9 years earlier. The same assessment applied now to a different structure mine, with a precision I understood completely. Not a compliment, an observation, the considered judgment of a man who knows the difference between what looks solid and what actually is. I nodded. We went inside. There are things I know now that I did not know on the Thursday evening in October, when I sat at a white tablecloth table at Bones on Piedmont Road and watched my father stand up, button his jacket, and walk out without a word. I know that the people who love you most are not always the ones who say the most. Sometimes they are the ones who have been quietly building something beneath your life for years. Not to control it, not to direct it, but to ensure that when the ground shifts, as it always eventually does, there is something real underneath you to land on. I know that silence is not passivity. In the right hands, wielded by the right person at the right moment, silence is the most precise instrument available. It requires no translation. It cannot be misquoted. It leaves no room for negotiation because it is not open to negotiation. It has simply arrived at a conclusion and allowed the world to catch up. I know that betrayal is not the end of a story. It is a structural failure that reveals what the foundation was actually made of. And what you discover in that revelation about the people around you, about the life they helped you build about yourself, is more honest and more useful than anything the intact version could have shown you. I know that a 1987 Rolex Datejust stainless steel champagne dial is not a watch. It is a statement. And the man who wore it for 20 years before transferring it to another man's wrist at a wedding reception understood from the first day he gave it what it would mean if he ever needed to ask for it back. I know that my father has never once in my entire life raised his voice at me. Not in anger, not in disappointment, not in the moments when I gave him reason to, and there were moments. He has always spoken at the same register with the same measured precision, and I used to think this was simply his nature, the occupational habit of a man who spent decades presiding over rooms where composure was a professional requirement. I understand now that it was something else. It was the demonstration of a principle he believed in so completely that he could not separate it from himself. That the most powerful response to any situation is the one that has been most carefully considered. That reaction is easy, and resolution is hard. And the distance between them is where character lives. He never raised his voice. He never had to. The Savannah waterfront project went into contract in January. I flew down on a Thursday morning with my structural drawings and my assessment notes, and the particular confidence of a woman who has recently passed a very significant test and knows with the certainty that only lived experience provides exactly what she is capable of. The developer, a man named Graves, serious, precise, the kind of person who asks the right questions and listens to the complete answer, walked me through the site along the river. He asked about load distribution, about foundation requirements, given the proximity to water, about the structural implications of the historic facade preservation mandate. I answered everything, cleanly, specifically, without hedging. At the end of the site visit, he shook my hand and said, "Judge Whitfield said you understand how things are supposed to hold." He wasn't wrong. I thought about the terrace on Peachtree Battle Avenue, about the magnolia tree in the backyard of the house on Tuxedo Road, bare in October and patient in the dark, about the unglazed window on the 14th floor of the Midtown building on the morning the clean pass came through, about a white tablecloth and a glass of Bordeaux, set down with a sound so small it should not have been audible, and yet I heard it with complete clarity across a restaurant on a Thursday evening in October. About 2 movements, left cufflink, then right, unhurried. "He taught me," I said. "My father and I have lunch on Thursdays now, his usual table at the Capitol Grill. He orders the same thing. We talk about the city, the projects, the people, the slow and permanent work of building things that are meant to last. Sometimes we talk about the case he handled in 2009. Sometimes we talk about nothing in particular, which with Raymond Whitfield is never actually nothing. Last Thursday, he was already seated when I arrived. He stood when he saw me, as he always does, one of the small, consistent courtesies of a man who was raised to believe that how you treat the people you love in ordinary moments is the truest measure of who you are. He looked well. The charcoal jacket, the French cuffs, the Rolex on his left wrist, its champagne dial catching the light the way it always had, the way it always would. I sat across from him. The waiter brought water. My father opened his menu, though he would not need it. "How was the Savannah project?" he said. "Foundation work starts next month," I said. He nodded, satisfied. The nod of a man who asked a question he already knew the answer to, because he wanted to hear me say it. We ordered. We ate. We talked about my mother's Portugal trip, finally rescheduled for spring. We talked about a former colleague of his who had recently been appointed to the 11th Circuit. We talked about the West Side project, which was on schedule and on budget, and would open to the public in 18 months under a name that did not include Derek Caldwell's anywhere on its facade. At the end of lunch, my father set down his coffee cup and looked at me across the table with the expression I have known my entire life. Clear, considered the look of a man who sees you completely and has made his peace with every part of what he sees. "You're all right," he said. Not a question, a determination. The verdict of a man who has spent a lifetime in the business of careful assessment, delivered with the finality and the gentleness of absolute certainty. "I am," I said. He picked up his coffee, looked out the window at Peachtree Road at Atlanta, moving past in the December light, permanent and unhurried, rooted in something so deep that no single season could touch it. "Good," he said. And that was enough. That has always been enough. Because from Raymond Whitfield, good is not a small word. It is the conclusion of a thorough examination. It is the clean pass on the final structural review. It is the sound of a man who built something beneath his daughter's life with 30 years of quiet, patient, deliberate love. and has looked at what it held and found it exactly as he intended. Some people love loudly. They announce it. They perform it. They require it to be witnessed and acknowledged and returned in kind. And when it is not, they experience the absence as failure. My father loves the way he builds carefully with attention to the foundation, with the long view in mind, without needing the acknowledgement of anyone who does not already understand the value of what they are standing on. I am my father's daughter. I know how things are supposed to hold.